Okay, so today's daf is Kufay. We are at the very top of Kufay Amud Aleph. We are going to do a little bit more Agadah, so that's, and then we're going to get into some slightly technical, but not too much. Okay, so we said Katav ot achat notarikon Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteram nechayev v'chachamim potrin. Basically, what this means is, if you normally you have to write two letters. A minimum of two letters to be liable for violating Shabbat. Ketiva is one of the melachot you're not allowed to do, writing. So what happens if a person writes one letter? Normally they would not be liable for the only one letter. They have to do at least two to have made an impact. What about if it's ot achat notarikon? You have one letter that stands for an entire word. So normally we say two letters is necessary because that's the minimum for it to be significant. But what if the one letter has significance? Like let's say the mem stands for 40. It stands for arba'im. Or you have other letters that could stand for entire words. So we had a machloket. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera said, since that one letter has a significance that's greater than the sum of its parts, so to speak, therefore you're liable for making a significant writing, even though you only wrote one letter rather than two. The Chachamim say, the rabbis say, no, you have to write at least two, and even though your one letter might have a grand significance, the bottom line is you've only written one letter, and therefore you have not fully committed the transgression yet. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra, Minayin l'lashon notarikon min haTorah. Where do you see the concept of an abbreviation, I guess you would call it, in the Torah, that one letter could stand for an entire word? Where do you see that anywhere in the Torah? So, Shene'emar, as it says, Ki av hamon goyim nitaticha. What does Hashem say to Avram when He renames him from Avram to Avraham? Ki av hamon goyim nitaticha. I have made you the father of many nations. Av hamon, the Gemara is saying, stands for something. Aleph, Bet, Hey, Mem, Vav, Nun stand for something. What does it stand for? So the Gemara explains. Av nitaticha la'umot. I have made you a father to the nations. Bachur nitaticha ba'umot. I have made you the chosen one among the nations. So that's Av, Aleph and Bet. Aleph is for Av, Bet is for Bachur. Hamon chaviv nitaticha ba'umot. I've made you a great and beloved person. That's the Hey of Hamon. Netaticha ba'umot. Melech netaticha ba'umot. La'umot, rather. The mem of Hamon is Melech, king. I've made you a king for the people. Vatik netaticha ba'umot. Vatik is generally understood as meaning humble or very pious. Ne'eman netaticha la'umot, and I've made you somebody trustworthy for the nation. So what that means is that each one of these letters has a symbolic significance. Av Hamon stands for father, chosen one, beloved one, king, pious one, and trustworthy one. Rabbi Yochanan Didei Amar. Rabbi Yochanan said, not in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra, but in his own name, Anochi. The word Anochi, when Hashem reveals Himself to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, and He says, Anochi, I am the Lord your God. What is Anochi? Is actually notarikon. It's actually an abbreviation for something. What is an abbreviation for? Ana nafshi, I myself, kativat yahivat, I have myself written the Torah and give it to you. Okay? So that's Anochi. Ani, or Ana, from the Aleph. Nun is nafshi, myself. And the chaf is I wrote it, and the yud is I gave it. Rabbanan Amrei, the rabbis say, Amira ne'ima ketiva yahiva. Amira ne'ima means a beautiful or a pleasant statement, meaning the Torah itself. Ketiva, written. Yahiva, given. So that's Anochi again. It stands for the beauty of the Torah. Igad Amrei, some say, Anochi lemafreya. You read it backwards. Yud, Kaf, Nun, Aleph. What is that? How does that work? Yahiva, Ketiva. A given, written thing. Ne'emanim amareha. Its words are trustworthy. So the word Anochi is in one way or another an abbreviation for one of these concepts. Devei Rabbi Natan Amrei, Rabbi Natan's yeshiva said the following: Ki yarata derech lenegdi. When Bilam has the famous argument with his donkey is being a little bit sassy, and talks back to him, and he says, why did you, what happened here? He starts arguing with the donkey, and then the angel appears, and the angel says, no, your donkey was right. I was trying to stop you. Ki yarat derech lenegdi, because the way was wrong. It was ki yarat derech lenegdi. It was a bad way that you were going. So yarat. What does this unusual word yarat stand for? Yarat derech lenegdi. Okay. The Gemara interprets it that yara the donkey was afraid. Ra'ata, the donkey saw the angel. Natata, the donkey turned away. Okay, so that's yarat. Yarat is a remez for the three things that the donkey did. Devei Rabbi Yishmael's yeshiva said, Tana Carmel, Carmale. What does Carmel mean? Carmel is a reference to the offering of the Omer. The offering of the Omer on Pesach. They would offer what it says, Geres Carmel. They would roast these whole grains of barley. Okay, they didn't process it, they didn't grind it, they actually just prepared it in its full form, and they would roast it. And Carmel means that it's a full, moist grain. It's not ground, it's not dried, and then they would roast it the way that it was. So what does Carmel mean? Carmale, that the chaff, the straw is full with the kernel of grain. Okay, Carmale. It's like a full pillow, right? It's a full entity. So next notarikon is Rav Achabar Yaakov Amar Vehu Kilelani Mretzet. Who is this? This is David HaMelech talking to Shlomo HaMelech on his deathbed, on the former's deathbed. David telling Shlomo, you need to deal with Shim'i ben Gera. Shim'i ben Gera is no good. Vehu Kilelani Mretzet. He cursed me with a terrible, egregious curse. Okay, so what does Nimretzet stand for? So what is so bad about the curse that Shimei ben Gera gave to David? What did he say? So the word Nimretzet actually stands for Nimretzet Notarikon. Nimretzet is an abbreviation for a symbolic representation of the curses that he gave him. Noefu, he said this David HaMelech is an adulterer. Why is he an adulterer? Because of Bathsheba. And so that's the nun of Nimretzet. Moavihu, he's a Moabite, he's not a real Jew because he descends from roots. So there's racial slur, not nice. We don't say that. That's the mem of Nimretzet. Rotzeahu, he's a killer because he killed Uriah HaChiti when he took Bathsheba. Tzoreru, he's an enemy. That's just a general critique, I guess. He's a troublemaker. To'evahu, he is an abomination, meaning he's what kind of a king is this that does these things? So that's what Nimretzet stands for. All of these critiques that he had. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, Man nidaber uman nitztadak. When the brothers are caught by Yosef for having stolen the goblet, well, not really, but he apprehends them after he planted the goblet on them. And they say, Man nidaber uman nitztadak. Yehuda says, what can we say? How can we justify ourselves? Man nitztadak. What does nitztadak mean? Nechonim anachnu. We are right. Tzadikim anachnu. We are righteous. Tehorim anachnu. We are pure. Dakim anachnu. That's another word for pure. Kedoshim anachnu. We're holy. So what nitztadak means is, we are all these good things. You have to look at the positive and not look at the negative. So by saying nitztadak, he's implying all these good things about them, although he doesn't try to argue with Yosef about whether they committed the crime or not, because there's no way to argue, there's no defense to have. He's implicitly saying, we are all these good things. How could we be guilty of this crime? The next Mishnah says, "Hakotev bet otiyot b'shtei ha'alamot achat shacharit v'achat ben arbaim Rabban Gamliel mechayev v'chachamim potrin." This is actually a Mishnah that's been quoted several times throughout Masekhet Shabbat in different contexts. What it's talking about is a person, again, has to, in order to be liable for Shabbat desecration by accident, inadvertent Shabbat desecration, which would mean that the person would have to bring, in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, a korban chatat. He would have to bring a sin offering for the mistake that he made and the error that he made. So it has to be done in a lapse of awareness. He didn't know what he was doing. If he did it on purpose, he doesn't bring a sacrifice, then he would be liable for violating Shabbat on purpose. If there were witnesses and they warned him, then he would have a very serious consequence of the death penalty. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about somebody who does it by accident. So in order to violate Shabbat by accident, you violate it, you have to complete the minimum measure of the melacha while you're still unaware. So what happens if the person wrote one letter, and then he realized, oh shoot, I wrote a letter and it's Shabbat and I completely forgot. I'm such a buffoon, whatever. Later on he comes back and he writes another letter, but he forgets again and he writes another letter. And then he realizes, oh my gosh, I wrote two letters now, that one and the one before. I'm really a buffoon now and I wrote two letters on Shabbat. So Rabban Gamliel says, now what's the problem here? The problem here is that he realized in between. So he divided his activities, he divided the activity, which should be the writing of two letters, into two separate activities. activities instead of one. And the question is, since he divided it into two activities, does that mean now he did two activities, neither of which has the minimum measure for liability? Or do we say that really, since the awareness that he had in the middle didn't have any significance, because he hadn't transgressed yet, we still consider his action as ongoing, and we hold him responsible for the whole thing. So that's what's going to happen. What is the machloket here? So basically, the Rabban Gamliel says like this. True, let's say you wrote Aleph and Bet. So after you wrote Aleph, you realized it was Shabbat and you had made a mistake. Then you went back and wrote Bet. Okay, but the only problem is that when you realized that you had written an Aleph, what were the implications of that realization? None, because you hadn't actually done the full measure of liability yet. You hadn't written two letters yet. So you really didn't do anything. So when you realized you had done something, you didn't realize you had done anything of any real significance. So then when you go, so we don't even count that. That's like that's like you were still unaware, because you hadn't committed any transgression yet fully. So we don't even count that. So when you go back and you write the second letter, we put it all together and we say you did one action. But the Chachamim say no, even though you didn't complete an action in the first lapse of awareness when you forgot it was Shabbat and you wrote the one letter, you didn't complete the transgression and you realized you had made a mistake. So even though there was no halachic implication of your awareness because you didn't fully commit the transgression yet, still it breaks the action into two different actions. So later on you forgot again, and your forgetting again really it separates it into two different transgressions, neither of which is sufficient to make you liable. So in essence, what you could say is, according to Rabban Gamliel, the becoming aware is really the main thing. When you become aware, okay, that becoming aware has to have some implication. If the becoming aware doesn't have any implication, it doesn't divide the actions into two different things. Whereas according to the Chachamim, it's the lapses that count. So since there was lapse number one, you became aware and you had lapse number two. So these two lapses are different lapses, and we treat them as two distinct transgressions, neither of which is sufficient to make you liable. So that's why you're not going to have an issue. Now, Rashi says, why does it mention that you wrote one letter in the morning and one letter in the afternoon? He says, because with such a long gap in between, there's an assumption you became aware in between. Tosafot says it's not automatic, though. Rashi implies that it's automatic, that if you did something in the morning and something in the afternoon, automatically we assume it's two different lapses. Tosafot says no, we don't necessarily assume that, because there are many cases where you could be in a lapse that you forgot it was Shabbat all day long. So therefore he says that you have to have actually become aware in between, and the fact that it mentions the morning and the afternoon is simply to show you that despite the fact that there's a long lapse in between, Rabban Gamliel still will combine the two lapses into one. Okay, so now that's Hadran ala Chaboneh, Hadran ala Chaboneh, Hadran ala Chaboneh. We finish that parak and we come to the next parak. This parak is a relatively short one. We're going to end up squeezing a lot of material. So what you've noticed is we've had a tremendous amount of material about carrying, and then there's a lot of short parakim like the one that we just did, just a couple of pages about construction and building and writing. And now we're going to get into a couple of mishnayot that are going to very quickly deal with all the melachot that have to do with weaving and sewing and materials and fabric. Okay, it's going to be very short, a little bit technical, but short. So Rabbi Eliezer says, Ha'oreg shelosha chutin batchila v'yachat ala rig chayav. How? And again, we're dealing with measurements of liability. So how much? At what point do we say that a person who is sewing on Shabbat or is weaving on Shabbat has actually committed the violation of weaving? So Rabbi Eliezer says he has to do at least He has to weave at least 3 threads. If he's starting a garment anew, in other words, he's starting a new garment, he sits down and he says, I want to make a blanket for my grandson, or whatever. Somebody goes and starts a sweater. So 3 threads through is the beginning of a new garment. But if you already have a garment, you've already started working on it, and you want to add. So if you're adding, Rabbi Eliezer says, even 1 string is enough, because you already have a significant entity there. It's already significant. You've added on. When you're creating something, to get it started, you need 3. But if you already have something and you're adding on, even 1 could be enough. For Chachamim, so the Chachamim say, the rabbis say, whether you're starting or you're in the middle, Now they say basof at the end, but they don't literally mean at the end, because we learned yesterday that even if you put one string on the end, if you're completing a garment, that's definitely significant. But what they mean is either at the beginning or in the middle of the process, 2 strings, 2 threads is what's considered significant. And now we come to something that's a little bit technical. It doesn't last that long, but I got a diagram for you to show you that I printed out. Now, ha'oseh shetei batei nirin banirin bakerus banafal bekvara uvasal chayav. So this is one of the melachot that's difficult to visualize, which is the oseh shnei batei nirin. What this is referring to is the way that they used to weave. I mean, it's not the way that they used to. It's still essentially the way that they do. But the way that a loom works. In order to understand the malacha, you have to understand a little bit about how the loom works. And there are whole sfarim written for rabbis and as people who are studying the Talmud to understand this one page of Gemara pretty much, and some other places where it comes up in Tumah v'Tahora, other places in purity and impurity where these issues arise, to understand how they did weaving, because you have to understand what they're referring to. So basically, to make a long story short, when you weave, obviously, in order to weave something, you have a string that moves across, and that's called in Hebrew, that's called you have the sheti and the erev. Okay, the erev is the one that goes across. The sheti is the one that stays straight. Yeah, it's called in English. It's called the woof strings, which are the ones that stay stable, and the weft, which is the one that goes across. Okay, in Hebrew it's called the erev and the sheti. The sheti is the one that stays like this, and the one that goes across is called the erev. So what happens is that in essentially, if you wanted to weave properly, what you would have to do is go over and under all the strings, and you have, if you're making a large garment or a blanket, you have hundreds and hundreds of threads. So you're going to have to go over and under and over and over and under and over and under. What? So you're going to have to do that 1,000,000 times. It's going to be very labor intensive. It's going to take you a long time to do that with every single thread, because they have hundreds and hundreds of them. So what do? You instead, what they do is they have a loom, which basically lifts first your odd numbered strings, and you pass it through, and then your even numbered strings, and you pass it through. So that way, when you lift the odd ones, it goes under the odd and over the even. When you lift the evens, it goes under the even and over the odd. So that way, basically, you accomplish covering all the strings in one.
They had these types of
passage. Yeah, even in the Torah it talks about the shetiv at the erev. Yeah, right. Even in the Torah it says it talks about the sheti and the erev. Even in the Torah. So now it was more. Now in this is like a sophisticated thing where they have this picture shows a structure with so they had these holes, they had these rings that they would pass the stationary strings through. Okay, in a type of it was a type of a board. Okay, and they would lift it and lower it, and then lift the other one. Right. Well, right. Not necessarily pedals, but however it worked. So that's what it looked like. Basically, that they would have them passing through the odd strings passing through one frame, and the even strings passing through another frame, and they would lift it alternately. And these circles that it passes through are called the batei nirin. These are called the houses of the nirin, because this is where it would pass through. Okay? Now, making one of these nirin, so Rashi says what that means is when you put 2 strings through these holes, that's the melacha, because you're setting the loom. Setting the loom is defined. What Rashi is saying here, setting the loom, or at least part of the process of setting the loom, is putting these strings through these holes. Now there are some that say no, it's actually making those loops that is the malacha, but we're just going to go with Rashi for simplicity, that Rashi says it's putting the strings through those loops that's considered the malacha of setting the sheti. Now the only thing is that, as we're going to see in the Gemara, they didn't exactly have a system like this. Theirs was slightly less sophisticated than what is shown in this picture. What they had was a pole that they would actually tie, rather than have these kind of rings and pass the sheti through the rings. They would have a pole that they would tie something that was on this board. There would be a board, and the board they would tie something up. They would tie a loop around the board and around each string. as opposed to having like a ring that's hanging down like that they would pass the string through, they would actually tie a string around a pole. Let's say there would be an even strings pole and an odd strings pole. So the even strings pole would have loops around it that would be tied to each one of the even strings, and the odd strings pole would have strings around it that would be tied to each one of the each one of the odd strings, and they would lift them alternately. They would lift poles alternately, however they did that. Okay, so that's what it means. How it says shetei batei nirin banirin. That if you, we're going to see more about this in the Gemara. Bakirus, we'll see what that is in the Gemara. Banafal b'kvara ubasal. If you weave baskets, basket weaving, you thought it was only a college major. But no, it's actually something that the Talmud talks about. If you weave a basket or a sieve or any kind of sieve, nafan, kavar, different kinds of sieves. So what they would do was they would make horizontal on the top, and they would put the vertical pieces in. So even though it's not really weaving, because as Rashi says, really you just had horizontals going around the bottom and the top, and everything else was vertical on the basket. You didn't have like a weaving up and down like you do in cloth, but still that was similar to setting the shati strings, setting these vertical strings in the loom, because you're putting them in place. You're putting each vertical piece of wicker or whatever you're working with.
Like you first described it, going through each string.
Right.
Going through each piece of whatever.
Right. Here you're just going from point A to point B. It's not as complicated, but the up and down. They would just put it across. They would just put the piece straight across. There wasn't a weaving process of up and down where you had horizontal strings and you had vertical string. We had vertical strings and then a horizontal string going up and down, alternate vertical strings. Here you have let's say on top and bottom stationary horizontal piece, and then you have vertical pieces just going up and down along the sides. That's the way that Rashi describes it. But anyway, it's similar. And somebody who is tofer shetei tefirot, he stitches 2 stitches. Now, really what they mean by 2 stitches seems to mean not what we think of as 2 stitches, but actually just in and out once. The in and the out is what they call 2 stitches, but then you have to tie it in order for it to stay. Or somebody who tears in order to make 2 stitches, which we would actually call 1 stitch, because they're just going in and out once. Okay, that's what they call it. Litfor is every time it penetrates the fabric. So shtei tefirot means to go in and to come out. It's really just one. And then they had to tie it to make sure it wouldn't move. Right, that's what it said earlier in the Gemara, because otherwise it's not permanent. Or if you tear something in order to put a stitch. So the Gemara says like this: when Rabbi Yitzchak came, he said shetayim. That Rabbi Eliezer never said that if you're starting a new garment you need 3 strings. He said you need 2. But didn't we learn 3? No problem. That one is talking about when you had thick strings, thick threads, and one is talking about thin threads. Which one is which? They weren't sure. In which case, do you need 2 thick and 3 thin? Or do you need 3 thick and 2 thin? Which one do you mean? So, it's possible to say that when you're dealing with large threads, you actually need more. You need 3. Because it's less stable. When you have thin threads and you tie them together, like if you tie 2 really thin threads, you can never, it's really tight. So maybe Rabbi Eliezer said if you're working with really fine threads, you only need 2. If you're working with thicker threads, you need 3 to make it stable. Or, alternatively, so you could say that the opposite, that when you have small ones, 3 are noticeable, but 2 are not noticeable. Whereas when it comes to thick strings, even 2 are noticeable. So we know that somehow in one case Rabbi Eliezer was saying you needed 2, and in one case he was saying you needed 3. We're just not sure. Was he referring to? Was the criterion the tightness of it? In which case 2 would be better for thin fibers, and 3 would be necessary for thick fibers? Or was the issue, how large of a thing have you made so far? How significant of a result do you have? Not how tight it is. In which case, 3 would be necessary if you're working with thin fibers. 2 would be enough if you're working with thicker threads, because then it's more noticeable even with just 2. So we don't really know which one is which. We just know that's what he was talking about. Tani, we learned in a Braita ha'oreg gimel chutin batchila v'yachal al harig chayav. As we learned according to Rabbi Eliezer, if you put 3 threads through the loom, 3 threads have been woven to make a new garment, or 1 on a pre-existing garment, that's enough. The rabbis say it doesn't matter whether you're just starting out or you're in the middle of a garment, you always have to weave at least 2 threads for it to be significant. And on the edge, so now what they're talking about here is that basically what they would have was they would have a garment, and at the edge of the garment, so let's say you weave a garment, and at the edge you would have, going in the opposite direction, actually you would weave it sort of in the opposite direction, a little edge on the end. Okay, they would make like a little, they call it a safa. There's like an edge going around the garment that would be different from the rest of the garment. Okay, it would be noticeably different from the rest of the garment going around the edge. So that was very thin. So there's 2 questions here. Number 1 is how many, because remember, we're passing strings through the loom. So one question is how many strings do you have to pass through the loom for it to be significant? The other question is how far through the loom do you have to pass it? In other words, how much surface area has to be covered? How many strings and how much do they have to cover of the vertical strings? How much does a horizontal have to cross? Okay, do you have to weave a certain length in addition to a certain width, let's say?
The whole shed?
So it says no. So it's saying even if it's very small, even if all you did was the lip, which goes only 3 batei nirin, which means it goes the distance of just 3 of these little spaces, which are exaggerated in this diagram, by the way, because there are actually like hundreds and hundreds of them in a real garment. No garment is spaced out like that. That would just be like a net. That wouldn't really be a garment, right? So it's a very small amount, but the point is that the width doesn't matter, even a small width, because on the lip of a garment that they would make, even a tiny width is significant. And he says, "Lemazeh domeh." What is this comparable to? It's comparable to laoreg tziltzul katan, shnei chutin berochav gimel batei nirin. So that when you make a little tiny thin belt, so in other words, there's a garment. The thinnest possible garment has to be the measurement, and the thinnest possible garment would basically be like a gartel that's very, very thin, a very thin belt that's only this wide. That's how much it has to go across. The thread has to go across.
And you have to do 2 of them.
At least 2, right? 2, but across only this amount, because the amount doesn't have to be that much, because we have to imagine that when we're defining significance for Shabbat, we define it in terms of the minimum amount that would ever be significant, which in this case would be the thinnest belt you could imagine. The width of it is only a little bit, and that's how much you have to cross.
So if you put 1 horizontal,
so you have to put 2 of the
one
right.
Twice.
The weft is the one that moves.
Okay,
so you have to move.
If you did 1 weft string through 2 widths,
right,
2 inches,
right, and then you did another one. 2
you
inches.
have to do another one.
You have to do another one. So it has to be 2. So there's a length measurement that's very small, and there's a width measurement you could think of it as, which is 2 strings. So the Gemara says, it sounds like that Braita is following Rabbi Eliezer, because the original opinion there is saying that you need 3 strings in order for it to, if you're starting a garment from scratch. That's Rabbi Eliezer. So why do we have a stam? Normally stam, when something is anonymous, that means we accept it. Are we following Rabbi Eliezer here? Don't worry. It's not true. Because Tanya idach haoreg berchutin ala gas v'ala imra chayav. Rabbi Eliezer omer afilu echad. U'basafa shnei chutin brochav shlosha batei nirin. Chayav. Ha'lamazeh domeh la'oreg tziltzul katan. So what you see there is the opposite. That there the anonymous opinion is saying whether you're working on the garment or you're working on the lip of the garment, it doesn't matter. 2 strings is always what's necessary. And Rabbi Eliezer says even 1 string if you're adding to a pre-existing garment. You don't need the 2 strings. And then they said, why is it that you only have to cross over the width or the length of only 2 of these spaces, or 3 of these spaces rather? The reason is because the smallest belt is only the width of about 2 of those spaces. 3 of those spaces rather. 2 strings have to cross 3 of those spaces. So stama. So now it says shnei chutin al rochav gimel batei nirin va'oreg bet chutin al agas v'leimra chayav stama kerabanan. So this braita actually follows the rabbis, because the anonymous opinion in this braita is the rabbis, and that's how we go. We say that it doesn't matter whether you're starting a garment or whether you're in the middle of a garment. Two strings have to cross, and they have to cross only a length of 3 of those spaces in the loom, which is actually very little. Now we just do one more part about this, and then we're going to get into something that's a little bit easier to digest. My banirin. Why does it say you make two of these loops in the nirin? What is it referring to? Amar Abaye tarte bebatei nira v'chada benira. So he says that what it means is that they would tie 2 loops around. What they would do was, or Rashi explains on the side here, that when they would attach the pole, basically, that they had, they didn't have like a frame like you see in the picture, but they had like a pole. So it says, Bet pamim markiv lechut shel sheti bebat nira. They would take the string that came off the pole, the frame, you can imagine. They would take that and tie it around the stationary string to hold it in place. And then they would put one, it says ve'achat benira, and a third time they would put it onto the rod itself. So they would tie it twice around the string that they're holding in place, and one more loop around the stick, the board itself that would move up and down. That's how they would tie it. So there were 3 tyings that were done, 2 times around the string. So if you imagine these strings that are crossing, so 2 times around the string it would be tied, and then 1 time around the board itself to hold it. That's how they would make sure that it stayed stationary.
And that's just for setting the vertical.
That's just for setting one vertical. So bekirus, what's the kirus? My kirus, amarav matzovita. So what it sounds like from Rashi that means the foot operated loom, like the sewing machine, right? The foot operated one, the one that the guy in the Fiddler on the Roof had, that Muttel had, and Fiddler on the Roof that he was so excited about. Yeah. So that's what they're talking about here. So the same thing. In other words, it doesn't matter what the apparatus is; they work in various ways. Setting the vertical threads in place is the melacha. So you have to do 2 of them, and when you've set them, but depending on the apparatus, it will be set differently. But obviously, it's describing here the way that they would do it in those days. So now we get to something. We're going to do a little bit on a similar topic, but it's going to move into Korea a little bit. Tearing. First you told me stitching 2 stitches, which again is really just 1 stitch, so is a melachan Shabbat. We already learned in the Mishnah previously that somebody who stitches 2 stitches has violated Shabbat. So why do you have to tell me again? Because it wanted to tell me about tearing. So it had to mention stitching to mention tearing. But kataninami hatofer v'korea. We also learned that in the Mishnah before. The reason why it mentions in our Mishnah that we just read about stitching is because about tearing is because in the next Mishnah it's going to mention somebody who tears a garment out of anger, or who tears because somebody, God forbid, passed away. And it's going to discuss, is that tearing considered a melacha or not? So it says somebody who tears a thread in order to stitch. So the Gemara asks, now where do you find somebody tearing in order to stitch? If you tear, you're going to ruin the whole garment, it's going to fall apart. So where do you find a where you tear like that? So Rashi explains, literally it means when there's like a pocket there. In other words, where you've done some uneven stitching and it started to fold over a little bit, and so you have to tear it in order to flatten it and restitch it. So that's what it's talking about, to put it under the seam basically and restitch something that has become loose. So that tearing is also melacha because you're tearing in order to fix. If you're tearing in order to fix, it's also considered constructive. So now the new Mishnah says, if somebody tears out of anger, because somebody passed away, and anybody who does any destructive act, piturin. Destructive acts are considered not a melacha. Melacha is creative. It's constructive. If you burn something to destroy it, it's destructive. It's not cooking. Cooking is using fire to create something, to improve something. However, if you destroy in order to build, You tear in order to sow. You destroy a house in order to rebuild a new house. So then the measurement is according to the tikkun. In other words, if you demolish the amount that, remember, a building, even the smallest amount is significant. So demolishing even a tiny bit in order to build is also constructive, because the demolishing is part of the construction. Tearing in order to sow, the measurement of tearing that's significant is the amount of fixing that's significant, because the tearing is part of the fixing process, and so on. Shi'ur ha'milaben v'ha'menapetz v'ha'tovea v'ha'toveh. So all these four melachot that have to do with fabric, whitening the fabric, combing the fabric, dyeing the fabric, spinning it into thread, is kimlo rochav hasit kaful. It's like the amount of a double sit. A sit is the space between the pointer finger and the middle finger. So double that is considered, when you stretch them out like this, when you stretch them as far as they can go, between the pointer and the middle finger, double that space is a rochav hasit kaful, is the width of a sit doubled. So that's the amount of thread that you would have to either whiten, comb, dye, or spin into thread in order for it to be considered a malacha on Shabbat. And similarly, somebody who weaves two strings, the measurement is kimlo hasit, is like the amount of a sit. So he doesn't say here sit kaful. He doesn't use the word kaful. So there's somewhat of a discussion if this is using the same measurement or only half of that measurement. Because this time it says a sit, which is just the space from here to here, not doubled. That's the amount of ariga. That's the amount of sewing, which would be considered significant in a normal garment. Because remember, before we were talking about somebody who was sewing the end of a garment, where that's that in and of itself is a self-contained entity. But in a normal garment, what's significant is this much, not the tiny amount of crossing 3 of the heddles. Crossing 3 of those loops is only significant when you're making something small. But when you're making a normal garment, this is the measurement that we use. The Gemara says, remember before we said...
That was weaving, wasn't it?
That was weaving. This is ariga, it's also the same. No, it's also weaving. Yeah, it's also weaving, not sewing. Yeah, I used the wrong term. Yeah, weaving, not sewing. So sewing is tfirah. Weaving is ariga in Hebrew. So here we're talking about weaving, but if you're weaving a lip on a garment or something smaller, so then we use a smaller measurement. If you're weaving an actual garment, we use a slightly larger measurement for that. So the Gemara says, we raised an objection. We learned in a Braita that tearing in anger, because in the Mishnah it said that if you tear in anger or you tear for your dead, that you are not considered to be doing something constructive. But we learned in a Braita that if somebody tears in anger, or they tear, because be'evlo al meto, right? They tear because they are mourning, like we tear when somebody passes away. So chayav. And in fact, even if a person, let's say they get so distraught, somebody dies on Shabbat and they tear their garment on Shabbat, so you're not supposed to do that. And even though they violated Shabbat, they still fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyah. So when they come to the funeral, they don't have to do the Kriyah now. So the Gemara asks, well, this is a contradiction, because the Mishnah just said that if you tear your garment for somebody who died, it's considered mekalkalin. It's considered destructive, not constructive. So lo kashe, no problem. No, our Mishnah that said that if you tear on somebody who died, it's not considered constructive. That's where it's not your relative. So you didn't do a mitzvah, you just tore something. Whereas when you tear for your relative, you're doing a mitzvah, so it's viewed as constructive. Okay? Veha meto katane, but doesn't it say in our Mishnah meto, his dead relative? So what do you mean it's not his relative? So le'olam b'met didei uvahanach telav b'nei avilut nenu. Very simply, it's talking about his relative, but not a relative that he's obligated to tear Kriyah for. You're not obligated to tear Kriyah for all of your relatives, only for the immediate relatives that you sit Shiv'ah for. So therefore, if you tear for any other relative, it's not a mitzvah. So all you did was tear your garment, that's it. All you get is a torn garment. Whereas if you tear for one of the relatives that you're obligated to tear for, you're doing a mitzvah. Then the Gemara says, Ve'i chachamhu, chiyuvei mechayev. But what if this relative is a chacham? If he's a wise person, V'detanya, we learned in the Braita, chacham shemet, hakol kirovav. We learned in the Braita that if the chacham dies, everybody's his relative. Hakol kirovav, salkatatach. Really? Everyone is his relative? Ela ema hakol ke kirovav. Everyone is like his relative. Hakol kora'in alav. Everybody tears their garment. Hakol choletzin alav. Everybody bears their shoulder. What they used to do was not just tear, but like we do in front, but they would tear the shoulder shoulder and they would pull down the shoulder of their garment and bare their shoulder. That was part of the tearing.
That they didn't have children?
What? No, for the community. Like if the chacham of the community dies, everybody tears kriya. Everybody also would bare their shoulder because that was considered a further sign of mourning that we don't really do anymore, the chalitza. But that was something that they used to do. They wouldn't just tear in the front, but they would tear all the way around, and they would pull down the shoulder of the garment. Hakol mavrin alav, everybody eats the sudat havra'ah, the morning suda that you have after the funeral. In the street. So, in other words, it's not in anyone's particular home, it's in the street because it's showing it's communal mourning. So what do you see? A chacham, also if you tear, it's considered a mitzvah. So of course the Gemara says, La tzricha de lav chachamu. So, okay, fine. So our Mishnah is talking about where it's not a chacham. So since he's not a chacham, he's only a chacham balayla. He's not a real chacham. So that's a chacham that it doesn't matter. Tearing for him is not a mitzvah. Ve'i adam kasher hu chiyuvei mechayev. But maybe this person's an adam kasher. Maybe he's a kosher person, a decent person. The Tanya says in the Braita, mipnei ma metim banav uvnotav shel adam kasher ktanim kedei shivkev yitabel al adam kasher. That the Braita says that why does a person's children die, sons and daughters, when they're young, so that he'll cry and mourn for an adam kasher, for a decent person. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Kedei so that he'll cry. Are they taking a collateral from him? Meaning they kill members of his family. Members of his family are dying so that later on he'll do a mitzvah? So it should say shasalo. So the idea is that a person is obligated, it's a mitzvah to cry and to mourn for an adam kasher, for a decent human being. Okay, a person who dies, he might not be a chacham, but he was a righteous person, a religious person. It doesn't matter that he wasn't a chacham. It's still a mitzvah. And it says not only that, but family members, the young children could die because of a lack of appreciation. In other words, just like this wonderful person died and you didn't appreciate, you didn't recognize that he was such a wonderful person. So now this could happen, God forbid, to your family, that people will die who are innocent, and then you'll learn to appreciate, so to speak, the people who are good and decent that you were indifferent to in previous times. And that's why it says that anybody who cries for an adam kasher, he's forgiven for all of his sins because of the kavod, because of the honor that he showed to this good person. In other words, we should appreciate people who die. We shouldn't take it lightly. We should see the good qualities that they have if they're an adam kasher. It doesn't have to be a talmid chacham, a great scholar, to be appreciated. And it's a mitzvah to appreciate them. And if we don't, if we do, it's a great mitzvah, because we've really shown humility in honoring another person in that way. And if we don't, it shows a callousness and an indifference to the good that person gave to the world. Lo tzricha de lav adam kasher. So certainly our Mishnah can't be talking about a case where you tore your garment for an adam kasher, because that would also be a mitzvah. So okay, fine. Now if you're there when the person actually passes away, you also have a mitzvah of tearing, even if they're not an adam kasher, even if they're no good bad guy. The Tanya, as it says in the Braita, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, that if a person is there when somebody actually passes away, they're supposed to tear their garment even if they're not related to the person. That's a mitzvah.
Today?
Yeah, even today. I mean, it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch and the Achronim that many people, that it's sort of not practiced today. It's not commonly practiced. But me'ikar hadin, the real halacha is that if you're there when somebody dies, even if it's not your relative, you would tear kriya.
That's not the funeral, that's when...
Right, if you're actually there. Yeah. So then there's a question about what about the mourners, that they're supposed to tear later when they, so they should tear later, but it's a complicated issue. It's not widely practiced today, but in theory that is the halacha. He says, why is it that you tear kriya for a person if you're there when they die? Because it's domeh l'sefer Torah shenisrafa. It's like seeing a sefer Torah being burnt. Because every Jew, as the Rashi says, every Jew is full of mitzvot, full of Torah. Even if he's not religious, even if he's not so pious, he's still full of Torah. And you see a Torah being torn, of course, you're going to tear your garments. So therefore, we must conclude that our Mishnah that says that when you tear your garment, it's not constructive, it's destructive, is talking about a case where it wasn't your relative, It wasn't a Talmid Chacham. It wasn't an Adam Kasher, and you were not there at the time when the person died. Because in all those cases, you would have a mitzvah. You would be doing a mitzvah. Tenach meto. Fine. You got out of the problem of our Mishnah that it said that when you tear for your relative, when you tear for your dead person, meaning it, therefore we must conclude it's a relative of yours, but not an Adam Kasher, not a Talmid Chacham, and you weren't there when they died, but you just decided to tear for them anyway because you like them. And you did it on Shabbat. It's destructive, not constructive, because you didn't do a mitzvah. Ela kashya. Well, what about the problem of ela chamato kashya? We still have a problem, because our Mishnah said that if you tear out of anger, it's destructive. But the Braita said, if you tear out of anger, hakoreh b'chamato, that you are liable. It's considered constructive. How could that be? So, chamato nami lo kashya, no problem. Ha Rabbi Yehuda, ha Rabbi Shimon. Ha Rabbi Yehuda damar melacha she'en tzricha legufa should be she'enat tzricha legufa chayav aleha. Ha Rabbi Shimon damar melacha she'en tzricha legufa patur aleha. So this is really the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon had a general principle, or Rabbi Yehuda has a general principle that it doesn't matter. If you do a melacha, whether it's for a constructive purpose because you want it, you want the result, or it's not for a constructive purpose, it's because you don't want it. For example, you blow out a candle because you don't want the light, or you take something out of the house into a public domain because you don't want it in the house. Those are considered melacha she'enat tzricha legufa, actions that are done to get rid of something, not to gain something. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't matter whether you did it to gain something or to get rid of something. According to Rabbi Shimon, it does matter. The only time we recognize you have doing something that's really considered a bona fide melacha, according to Rabbi Shimon, is when you did something positive, when you wanted the result, not when you were doing an action to get rid of something you didn't want. We actually follow, well, it's a machloket actually, Rishonim, who we follow. The Rambam follows Rabbi Yehuda, a lot of others follow Rabbi Shimon. It doesn't matter because it's only a matter, everyone agrees you're not allowed to do it, it's just a matter of whether it's rabbinic or biblical. Yeah. So Rashi explains on the side that basically since you are alleviating anger here, right? Tearing out of anger is to get rid of anger. Right. So Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't care. We don't care whether you're doing something to get rid of something or to gain something. It's still a melacha, because you did it. So you did it to get rid of anger? Fine, but you still had a purpose. It still had a purpose. You got rid of something, you got rid of your anger. You let it out. Rabbi Shimon says, no, letting something out, no, because you would rather have not been angry to begin with. Just like if you blow out a candle, you would rather the light not be there. You're not creating anything by blowing it out. So Rabbi Shimon says that's not a biblical violation of Shabbat. Rabbi Yehuda says it's still a biblical violation of Shabbat. Okay, so here too, Rabbi Shimon would say tearing out of anger, you're getting rid of something, you're getting rid of those bad feelings, so it's only rabbinically prohibited. Rabbi Yehuda will say no, it's actually biblically prohibited because we don't care the reason. You did it because you wanted to do it. It doesn't matter that you were getting rid of anger or you were gaining something out of it. So, but then the Gemara says, wait a second. But even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that when you do a destructive action, we don't hold you liable. How can you hold someone liable for a destructive action? Amar Rabbi Avin says, Hi nami mitakenu deka'aved naharuach liyitzro. That's the answer. You are satisfying your evil inclination of anger. So when you get really angry and you want to start smashing stuff, you're satisfying the bad part of your nature. So Rabbi Shimon might say, that's considered getting rid of something still, because you're getting rid of the feelings of anger by letting it out. So you might be exempt. But Rabbi Yehuda will say, the fact is you're gaining something. Maybe you would rather not be angry to begin with, but you're gaining something. It's not a destructive action because you're getting yourself emotional comfort by destroying the garment. Okay, I gavna misharei. But wait a second, how can you endorse somebody doing such a thing, tearing a garment out of anger? It should be looked at as a sin in its own right to tear a garment out of anger, and therefore we shouldn't recognize it as a constructive thing at all. It should be considered destructive, even if it lets you satisfy your anger. Ve'atani, we learned in a bright, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Mishum Chilfa bar Agra, in the name of Chilfa bar Agra, She'amar Mishum Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who said it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, HaMikareya begadav b'chamato, somebody who tears garments out of anger, V'ameshaber kelav b'chamato, or smashes vessels out of anger. V'amefazer ma'otav b'chamato, or he throws his money all around out of anger. We've seen all these things in, Yeh be'einecha k'oved avodah zarah. He should look like an idolater to you. Why? Shekach umanato shel yetzer hara. This is how the yetzer hara works. Hayom omer lo asekach. Today he says, do this stupid thing, right? Oh, break this. You're angry, break this. Rip this, throw this. And the next day he tells him to do something worse. Until he says, you know what? Go worship idolatry. It's like the people who get angry, and then they leave. They don't like something in the synagogue, they go become a Christian and join a church. The crazy people, they do that. Yeah. Right? You hear stories about that. The people that get so angry that I remember reading a story about it, and I can't remember who it was, but there's a famous story about somebody, and it's escaping me who it was, but a famous public figure. Maybe it was a famous politician who was of Jewish descent and whose father basically converted to Christianity because he got angry with the Jews in the synagogue or something like that. He got so angry that they ran and he became a Christian. It was something crazy like that. But the idea is, if you let your anger get the best of you, and it's interesting that it's talking about breaking things and tearing things as a sin, because when you have anger inside, everybody gets angry inside sometimes. But when you let it come out in stupid action, that's when you're in trouble. It's one thing to be angry and you feel the anger. It's another thing to go do something, to act on it because you're serving it. You're letting it control you. You're letting it control you and do something destructive to yourself. You just tore your clothing. You just threw your money. Or or whatever you did out of anger. If you actually let the anger get the best of you and translate into self-destructive behavior that you hurt yourself, now you're really not thinking anymore. That's why he's saying it should be like an idolater. A person like that is unstable, he's volatile, and he's going to end up being an idolater. So it's a terrible thing. So how can we call that a constructive action? So the answer is, he says, Amar Rabbi Yavin, my kira'a. And what's the pasuk for this? To show you that that's true. Lo yabacha el zar v'lo tishtachvel nechar. It says, don't have in you a false god, and don't bow to an alien god. What strange god exists in a person? This is the evil inclination inside you. That if you start serving it, in other words, if you let those emotions get the best of you and you start serving them, you'll eventually serve an idolatrous god too. So what it says is that there's only one case where showing anger can have an impact that's constructive, and breaking stuff can be constructive. What is that? When you're trying to instill fear in others, like sometimes you'll see those drill sergeants, they'll break something to scare the people, or the teacher smashes the thing on the table in order to scare the students. So you're trying to inspire a little bit of awe in others. So you're not really, in other words, like the Rambam says in Hilchot Deot, never really be angry, but he says act angry if you need to, in order to strike fear into other people. If you need to discipline people, something you have to act angry. Don't let yourself feel the anger, because then you're really letting it get the best of you. But show anger to others so they fall into line. So what's the example here? So he says, Ki hader Rav Yehuda shalif matzvaita, that Rav Yehuda, when he was angry with his servants or his family, he would tear his garment in front of them to show how angry, like I'm in business, but he didn't really get angry. Rav Achabar Yaakov Tavar Maneh Tevirei, he would take already partially broken stuff and smash it, in order to scare the people. Rav Sheshet Ramila La'amate Monena Aresha. Rav Sheshet would pour fish on the head of his maidservant when she did fish brine on her head when she didn't do good work.
That he was blind.
Rav Sheshet was. I don't know how he was able to aim.
He said, "Where are you?
Where are you? Stand right here. I need to tell you something." And then he poured it. I don't know. Okay, that's Rav Sheshet. Rabbi Abba Tavar Nachtema, and Rabbi Abba would break the cover of a jar in order to inspire fear in others. So all of these are descriptions of people who didn't actually get angry, but would demonstrate anger in various ways in order to instill fear. And what does this show you? This shows you that a person, in certain cases, the tearing would be considered a constructive action and not a destructive one if it's being done in order to instill discipline and fear in other people. Now, the point, though, is that according to where the Gemara has it now, since tearing the garment is an assuaging of the anger in the person, even though we don't endorse tearing a garment. In other words, we're not endorsing it as a permitted thing that somebody should ever do that. But if they did it in order to alleviate their anger, it's considered constructive because it gives them satisfaction. Okay, and so there's a difference between a pure, or in this case, because it instills fear in the other people. Okay, so by disciplining them. So there has to be a constructive thing. Simply tearing in a destructive way and throwing in the garbage, like you tear something and throw it in the garbage, that's not constructive at all. It has to some way either psychologically give you some satisfaction or instill fear and trembling in others to discipline them. But simply tearing an item as a destructive action is not itself significant. And we're going to end here for today because the next piece is a beautiful, we can start tomorrow with the beautiful Agadot about properly honoring those who pass away by giving them proper hespedim and eulogies and the blessings that come with appropriately mourning the loss of good people. So we're going to start on a nice inspiring note tomorrow.